The ancient battlefield stretched before Sun Tzu as he surveyed the terrain, carefully calculating his next move. It was 506 BCE, and the renowned Chinese military strategist was preparing to lead Wu forces against the state of Chu. All warfare is based on deception, he told his commanders, words that would echo through centuries and eventually be recorded in his seminal work, The Art of War. Nearly 2,500 years later, corporate CEOs studied these same principles before major negotiations, political leaders reference them when planning campaign strategies, and military commanders still train using Sun Tzu's timeless wisdom. The thread connecting ancient battlefields to modern boardrooms reveals a fundamental truth: the core principles of strategy transcend time. In the spring of 216 BCE, Hannibal Barca stood on the plains of Cannae in southeastern Italy, vastly outnumbered by Roman forces. The Carthaginian general faced approximately 86,000 Roman soldiers with his army of just 50,000. Rather than retreating, Hannibal employed what would become known as the double envelopment or pincer movement. He positioned his weakest troops in the center, which intentionally collapsed under Roman pressure. As the Roman forces pushed forward, believing they were winning, Hannibal's stronger African infantry on the wing swung around to encircle the Romans completely. The result was devastating. Up to 70,000 Roman soldiers perished in what historians consider one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers in military history. Today, this same pincer strategy appears in modified form in contexts ranging from modern warfare to business competition. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf used a variation of this ancient tactic, fixing Iraqi forces in place with frontal attacks while maneuvering mobile forces to cut off retreat and supply lines. In business, companies like Amazon have employed similar strategic thinking by attacking competitors from multiple directions simultaneously, expanding into new markets while squeezing competitors on price and service. Julius Young, a professor of strategic studies at West Point Military Academy, explains, "What makes these ancient strategies relevant today is that they account for fundamental human psychology and organizational behavior, which has not changed significantly over millennia." The Roman general Scipio Africanus demonstrated this understanding when he defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Rather than challenging Hannibal's strengths directly, Scipio neutralized the Carthaginians' elephant charge by creating lanes in his formation that allowed the beasts to pass through harmlessly. He then methodically dismantled Hannibal's forces by exploiting weaknesses in their positioning. This approach, targeting an opponent's vulnerabilities rather than strengths, remains foundational to modern asymmetric warfare and competitive strategy. In 331 BCE at Gaugamela, Alexander the Great faced the Persian king Darius III and a numerically superior force. Instead of spreading his troops evenly, Alexander concentrated his cavalry on the right flank, creating a powerful striking force. He personally led this cavalry in a charge toward Darius, while intentionally opening a gap in his center. As Persian troops rushed into this apparent weakness, Alexander's elite unit swung around to attack the Persian forces from behind. Darius fled, and his army collapsed. This technique of creating a strategic gap to draw an opponent into a vulnerable position has been adapted countless times. During the Gulf War, coalition forces used deception operations to convince Iraqi commanders that the main attack would come from the sea, drawing their attention away from the actual flanking maneuver through the desert. In corporate strategy, Netflix initially appeared to seed the physical DVD market to Blockbuster while developing streaming technology that would ultimately render the traditional rental model obsolete. The concept of asymmetric advantage, using specialized capabilities to overcome larger forces, dates back to ancient Greece. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, plus several thousand allies, held off the massive Persian army by using the narrow mountain pass to negate the Persians' numerical advantage. Though the Greeks were ultimately defeated, their stand allowed the Greek city-states crucial time to prepare a successful defense. Modern applications of this principle abound. In the business world, smaller companies routinely compete with industry giants by focusing on niche markets where their specialized knowledge provides an advantage. In military contexts, the entire field of special operations is built around the concept that small, elite units can achieve strategic objectives that would be impossible for conventional forces. Perhaps no ancient commander better understood the value of intelligence and psychological warfare than Genghis Khan. In the early 13th century, the Mongol leader built the largest contiguous land empire in history not solely through military might, but through sophisticated information networks. Before attacking a new territory, Mongol scouts would gather detailed intelligence on terrain, fortifications, and political divisions. Genghis Khan would then exploit internal conflicts, often turning potential enemies into allies. When resistance seemed likely, he cultivated a reputation for overwhelming violence against those who opposed him, but mercy toward those who surrendered, a psychological tactic that often led to cities capitulating without a fight. The Mongols essentially pioneered what we now call information warfare, explained Sophia Anderson, historian specializing in Central Asian military history. Their intelligence networks were so effective that they often knew more about their enemies' territories than the rulers themselves. Today, this emphasis on intelligence gathering and psychological operations has only grown in importance. Modern militaries invest billions in surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. In 2011, U.S. intelligence agencies tracked Osama bin Laden to a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, gathering detailed intelligence before the raid that resulted in his death. The operation's success relied on months of covert surveillance and intelligence analysis, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan's approach. The Byzantine Empire, facing existential threats from multiple directions, developed sophisticated diplomatic strategies to divide potential enemies. Emperor Justinian I, 527–565 CE, routinely played rival powers against each other, forming temporary alliances with one group to neutralize another. This approach, detailed in contemporary sources like Procopius's History of the Wars, enabled Byzantium to survive for centuries despite frequently being militarily outmatched. The strategy of dividing opponents remained central to geopolitics. During the Cold War, the United States exploited the Sino-Soviet split to improve relations with China and increase pressure on the Soviet Union. More recently, Russia has employed divide-and-rule tactics within the European Union, supporting Eurosceptic political movements to weaken European unity on issues like sanctions. Ancient Rome's approach to occupied territories offers another strategy with modern resonance. Rather than simply imposing direct rule, Rome often incorporated local elites into their governance structure, allowing significant local autonomy while ensuring loyalty to Rome. This practice of indirect rule and cultural assimilation created stakeholders who benefited from Roman rule, reducing the likelihood of rebellion. The Romans understood that sustainable empire required more than just military dominance, Julius Young notes. Their genius was in creating systems where local populations saw benefits in Roman rule. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine reflects similar principles. The U.S. Army's Field Manual 3-24, developed during the Iraq War, emphasizes the importance of working through local governance structures and gaining population support rather than focusing exclusively on eliminating enemy combatants. The concept of strategic patience, waiting for the right moment to act rather than rushing into conflict, finds perhaps its clearest ancient expression in Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator of Rome in 217 BCE after Hannibal's devastating victory at Lake Trasimene. Rather than confronting Hannibal directly, Fabius adopted what became known as the Fabian strategy, avoiding major battles while harassing Hannibal's supply lines and wearing down his forces. Though criticized by contemporaries for apparent cowardice, his approach gradually weakened Hannibal's army and prevented further catastrophic defeats. This strategy of attritional warfare appears throughout history. During the American Revolutionary War, George Washington frequently avoided direct confrontations with superior British forces, instead focusing on preserving his army while gradually wearing down British resolve. More recently, insurgent groups in Afghanistan employed similar approaches against technologically superior forces, avoiding direct engagements while maintaining steady pressure through ambushes and improvised explosive devices. In the business world, strategic patience manifests in companies willing to sustain short-term losses for long-term advantage. Amazon operated at a loss for years to build market share, while Tesla invested billions in electric vehicle technology long before profitability appeared on the horizon. The ancient Chinese strategist Zhuge Liang, 181–234 CE, demonstrated the power of information control during the Three Kingdoms period. In one famous episode known as the Empty Fort strategy, Zhuge found himself in an indefensible position at Shiqing with only a token force when enemy General Sima Yi approached with a large army. Rather than attempting a doomed defense, Yuga ordered the gates opened and sat calmly playing his guqin, a stringed instrument, on the wall. Sima Yi, suspecting a trap because of Yuga's reputation for cunning, withdrew his forces without attacking. This manipulation of information, creating uncertainty in an opponent's mind about your true capabilities, remains central to modern strategy. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara deliberately obscured whether U.S. naval forces would stop or sink Soviet ships approaching Cuba, creating strategic ambiguity that gave Soviet leaders pause. The principle of force concentration, massing resources at decisive points rather than dispersing them equally, finds clear expression in Alexander the Great's campaigns. At Gaugamela, despite being outnumbered overall, Alexander concentrated his best cavalry at the critical point of attack, creating local superiority that led to victory. Alexander understood that victory often comes not from having more resources overall, but from having more resources at the decisive point of contact, explains Julius Young. This principle remains as valid in corporate resource allocation as it was on ancient battlefields. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was producing a confusing array of products with limited resources. Jobs drastically cut the product line to focus on a few core offerings, concentrating Apple's design and engineering talent where it could make the most impact. This strategic concentration of resources transformed a struggling company into one of the most valuable in the world. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, 559 to 530 BCE, demonstrated remarkable strategic foresight in his conquest and governance. Before major campaigns, Cyrus established elaborate logistical systems, including food storage depots along planned invasion routes. This logistical preparation enabled his armies to operate effectively far from their home territories. Additionally, Cyrus established a sophisticated relay system of mounted couriers, the ancient world's fastest communication network, allowing him to maintain control over his vast territories. Modern military planners similarly recognize that logistics often determine strategic outcomes. During Operation Desert Shield in 1990-91, the United States moved over 500,000 personnel and millions of tons of equipment to Saudi Arabia before combat operations began, a massive logistical undertaking that laid the groundwork for the subsequent swift victory. The ancient world also offers lessons in strategic flexibility. In 202 BCE at Zama, when Scipio Africanus found his tactics against Hannibal not working as planned, he quickly adjusted his formations, reorganizing his cavalry to counter Hannibal's movements. This ability to adapt plans in response to changing circumstances prevented a potentially devastating defeat. Modern military doctrine emphasizes this same flexibility. U.S. Marine Corps teaching centers around the concept of commander's intent, ensuring subordinates understand the purpose of a mission so they can adapt tactics if circumstances change while still achieving strategic objectives. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, between Athens and Sparta demonstrates the dangers of strategic overreach. Athens, despite its naval dominance and wealth, ultimately lost after the disastrous Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BCE. Thucydides, the great historian of the conflict, described how Athenian ambition led them to extend their forces too far, creating vulnerabilities that Sparta and its allies eventually exploited. The Sicilian expedition represents perhaps the clearest ancient example of strategic overreach, notes Sophia Anderson. Athens' resources were finite, but their ambitions were not, a dangerous combination that has brought down empires throughout history. Modern parallels are abundant. The Soviet Union's costly war in Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989, contributed to its eventual collapse, while the United States' protracted conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan strained military resources and public support. In business, companies that expand too rapidly or into too many unrelated markets often find themselves vulnerable to more focused competitors. The Romans demonstrated remarkable strategic learning capacity following their defeat at Cannae. Rather than abandoning the war, they analyzed Hannibal's tactics and adapted their approach. The Romans avoided major set-piece battles where Hannibal excelled, instead focusing on smaller engagements and targeting his supply lines. They also studied and eventually adopted superior elements of Carthaginian military technology, particularly in cavalry equipment and tactics. This capacity for institutional learning remains critical today. After the Vietnam War, the U.S. military underwent substantial reforms, revising doctrine and training to address identified weaknesses. Similarly, successful companies institutionalize processes for learning from failures rather than repeating them. In the desert outside Memphis, Egypt, in 1274 BCE, Pharaoh Ramesses II faced the Hittite army at Kadesh in what is considered history's first well-documented battle. When Hittite chariots broke through Egyptian lines and threatened to rout his forces, Ramesses personally led a counterattack that stabilized the situation. While the battle ended in a tactical draw, Ramesses' personal courage at a critical moment prevented a complete defeat. The impact of leadership in crisis moments remains as relevant today as it was over 3,000 years ago. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, Winston Churchill's resolute leadership and powerful rhetoric helped sustain British morale during the German air assault. In business, Lee Iacocca's visible leadership during Chrysler's near-bankruptcy in the early 1980s helped rally employees and restore public confidence in the struggling company. The principles of coalition warfare, the challenges and opportunities of fighting alongside allies, appear clearly in the Greek response to Persian invasions. Before the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, Themistocles, the Athenian commander, had to manage significant disagreements among Greek city-states about defense strategy. Through a combination of persuasion, deception, and outright manipulation, he successfully kept the coalition together and maneuvered the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis, where Greek triremes held the advantage. Modern coalition operations face similar challenges. During the 1991 Gulf War, General Norman Schwarzkopf managed a coalition of 35 nations with different military capabilities, political constraints, and strategic objectives. The NATO alliance in Afghanistan struggled with national caveats, restrictions different countries placed on how their forces could be employed, which complicated unified operations. Looking across these ancient examples reveals enduring principles that continue to shape strategic thinking today. While technology, societies, and specific contexts have changed dramatically, the fundamental dynamics of human conflict and competition remain remarkably consistent. What makes these ancient strategies relevant is that they address timeless aspects of human nature and organizational behavior, Julius Young observes. Fear, ambition, loyalty, perception, deception, these factors influenced ancient battles and continue to shape modern conflicts, whether military, political, or commercial. The principles these ancient strategists identified, deception, concentration of force, intelligence gathering, psychological operations, strategic patience, adaptability, coalition management, and learning from failure, represent not just historical curiosities but practical tools for navigating today's complex strategic environments. For modern leaders, whether in militaries, governments, or corporations, these ancient lessons offer valuable perspective. They remind us that while technologies change rapidly, the fundamental principles of strategy evolve much more slowly. By studying how Hannibal outmaneuvered the Romans at Cannae, how Alexander concentrated forces at critical points, or how Themistocles managed a fractious coalition, today's decision-makers gain insights applicable to contemporary challenges. Perhaps most importantly, these ancient examples demonstrate that strategy is ultimately about human decision-making under conditions of uncertainty, competition, and constraint, conditions that remain as present today as they were on the battlefields of antiquity. The generals who walked these ancient fields in sandals and armor would recognize the strategic dilemmas faced by their counterparts in modern uniforms, business suits, or political offices. The wisdom of Sun Tzu, Themistocles, Alexander, Hannibal, and other ancient strategists reminds us that while the specific applications may change, the principles of effective strategy endure. Their insights, tested across millennia, continue to guide those who seek advantage in the complex landscapes of modern competition and conflict.